Good afternoon. So I'm Andrew Chen, the moderator today for the fascinating club lunch. I'm part of the FCC professional committee. My day job is I manage risk and opportunity for one of the leading energy provider in Hong Kong. Today we are very happy to have our speaker, Dr. Tao Wang, the chief China economist for UBS Investment Bank in Hong Kong. Dr. Wang formerly worked for the IMF. She has a tiny new book, this book, Making Sense of China's Economy. And that's exactly what we are going to be doing today. So making sense of China's economy. So welcome to the FCC Club Lunch, Dr. Tao Wang. Before we launch into the club talk presentation, I would like to provide a brief introduction to the book and also quoting directly from the book as well. So for years, China's transformation from one of the world's poorest nations was lauded as a triumph that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. There's always a question about data reliability and growth sustainability, and the general views that on China have recently taken a decidedly sour turn. Concerns abound about state interference in the economy, an aging population, and high debt level. Making sense of China's economy untangles China's complex economic structures, evolving issues, and curious contradictions, and explains some key aspects of this most puzzling of global economic powerhouses. Without more to say, I would like to pass on to Dr. Tao Wang for presentation, and then we're going to have a moderated discussion after this as well, and then we're going to open up to the audience for questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that nice introduction. And I am very grateful for FCC to give me this opportunity to come here and share with my understanding of China's economy. I think it will be a difficult task to make sense of China's economy in one lunch session, but we are going to try to make some effort. And I thank you also very much for coming here in the very hot weather. I was climbing the hill a bit and I thought, wow, that's a tall hurdle. So I will start by maybe explain a little bit my motivation for writing the book. As Andrew mentioned, I've been covering China's economy for a few decades, and I've been working for UBS for more than 15 years. So through my interactions with investors all over the world, reporters from all kinds of media outlets, I've been asked all kinds of questions on China. But some questions never change. For example, is growth sustainable? How big is the debt problem? And there is never enough space to write in an investment bank report. So I thought to put this down more comprehensively. But secondly, also I think the narrative, as Andrew mentioned, the narrative about China and China's success has kind of changed in recent years along with the political wind. I thought it was probably a good idea to review a bit what happened since 1978, and that review of history, how far we have come along, what kind of contradictions there still is, can maybe help inform our outlook for the future as well. So I will start maybe by talk a little bit about, I think, misconceptions and okay, I cannot see that far, but so I guess if there's one thing I would like for you to take away from this talk is, I think after my decades of looking at China's economy, one thing I learned is not to extrapolate. I think extrapolation is something very tempting. When we see things not going well, then we think, it's not going to go well, it's going to go down. That's structural. Everything is structural. Or even there could be fatalistic ideas that this will never get good. And then things really boom, and then we may have optimistic ideas. And I think that's probably one reason why China's growth and economy in the last especially 2+ decades, have defied many predictions of doom. And I think one thing we learn is not extrapolate and look a little deeper. In terms of the thing I wanted to mention a bit is about misconception about China's economy. I think often people think that in China, policies are dictated from the top. One or few person decides what to do, everybody carries out. And the government is a monolithic apparatus that policies are just made top down. And they can come out of nowhere. It seems to be especially the case in the last few years, but I wanted to say that's not the case. That's a misconception. One of the most important reform in China, arguably, the dissemination of the collective farming, the agricultural reform, did not come from Deng Xiaoping, did not come from the World Bank. It came from 18 farmers in Anhui province, risking their lives for a couple of years before their contract was finally okayed by the Politburo, by the senior leadership. And also, I think that in China, government agencies, local governments and central government have different interests. Their interests are not always aligned. They don't carry the policy directive uniformly. There's often a lot of contradictions, and the biggest example is on property policy. As we have witnessed many ups and downs in the property cycle, often because even though the central government always worry about risk, housing price being too high, local governments always want to sell land at the highest price, make the most profit out of it, always try to push for higher property as well. So then we get a lot of distortions in this tug of war between local and central government. So these are just some examples. Also in terms of policies, I think they tend to come from, even though there are policy decisions from the top, but they often do not just come out of nowhere. The government's policy, economic policy objective often rises from difficulties in the economy or changing priorities within the society. In the 70s and 80s, the biggest challenge for China is to have enough food to feed people. People were starving. And so the agricultural reform was the first necessary ones to liberalize productivity at that time. Later, even at the late 90s and early 2000s, China had more than 20 million people coming to the labor force each year. You still had 20 million people coming from the rural area to the urban area. You needed growth and you needed to generate employment. And then later on, I think around the time of the global financial crisis, the priorities start to change. Wage growth start to pick up. People cared more about cleaner air, food safety, drug safety. They cared less about GDP growth at 10%. What does that mean to me? If my kids cannot go to school and that my food is not even safe, what are we growing for? So priorities start to change. So I'm just saying that some of the policies when the government start to tighten environmental regulations, implement a labor law and so on, they come from some shifts in the society and economy, and that priorities start to change. I remember in 2007 at when China's growth was 14%, GDP growth was 14%. China seemed to be at the height of its economic ascent. Premier Wen Jiabao said China's growth was uncoordinated, unbalanced, unsustainable. There was another, I forgot, but basically he was calling for a lot of structural reforms and change of the growth, debt-driven and investment-driven growth model, and asked for change of the role of the government versus the market, the state versus the market. And so that leads me to the next question, which I think in the last few years is very high on everybody's mind about China, which is the role of the state versus the market. There has been quite a bit of a doubt as to whether the state is taking a bigger role, SOEs are taking a bigger share. If we look at news report, we would get this impression that since 2008, that has been the case, that the state is getting bigger and bigger, and the private sector is retreating. And I wanted to show, okay, I missed some, so with this chart, I can show you that this is the SOE shares in the industrial sector, and then the lower chart is the 2018 SOE share by different industries. We don't have historical data for every industry. Industrial sector is a good example. So it's true that in the 80s and 90s, China, especially 90s, China embarked on massive market-oriented reform, and the state-owned enterprises share dropped dramatically. But it has since 2000, since the mid-2000s, the share has hardly changed. So it's true that we have not seen further SOE reform and further advance of the private sector. But it's also not quite true that the state-owned shares are rising. They are not really rising either. But so why do people have this impression that the state is playing a bigger and bigger role? So I go back to 15 years ago when China was talking about adjusting the role of the state. This is the market, because the state was also absent in many areas, especially in public spending, in social safety net, in labor protection, in environmental protection, in market regulations, and so on and so forth, but especially in social spending. I mean, even now it's still relatively weak compared to OECD countries. So the idea, and that is comprehensively laid out in the 2013 Third Plenum reform document, the idea was that the state should increase its role in providing public goods and a social safety net, and be the referee in the market. But at the same time, the state was supposed to exit from some of its direct involvement in the economy, in investment, in state ownership. SOEs were supposed to retreat from competitive sectors, and also the market was supposed to play a decisive role, or principal role, in resource allocation, and the government was just playing a better role. So those were the official statements. But what happened, of course, was that the state did increase its role in public services and goods. Pension coverage, healthcare insurance coverage did expand. Environmental standards improved. However, I think in terms of resource allocation, we have seen very little reform. So in terms of capital allocation, land allocation is still very much dominated by government or government-owned banks. And also in terms of the exit by SOEs from various sectors, that hasn't really happened. So I showed you the share didn't really decline either. And the regulations across the board have increased as well. So I think even though, so this gives you the background, even though that the government talked about increasing its role in certain areas and reducing its role in certain areas, in the reduction part, they have not really done much. That's why it gives this impression that the role of the state is just keep increasing. So what about going forward? Well, I think that it's probably a little too early to say. So I'm not as pessimistic, as you can see from some people in the market, to say the state is going to take over everything, because I can see from the data, despite our impression, it hasn't. And also in terms of ownership, and also we can note from the 20th Party Congress, when many of us feared that there could be a different direction, there is a reiteration that the party and the government wants to stick with the market-oriented reform. They reiterated the term of unwavering support to the private sector. Recently, of course, there is a more positive message in that front. Of course, I think it is a bit too early. We need to see how specifically these kind of policies are actually implemented to see if there are material change going forward. But it is a key question, of course, that in people's minds. So I just wanted to give a slightly nuanced point on that. I will go through very quickly a few other points so that I don't, we have time to talk to each other. So there are a lot of, structural issues we talked about, property bubble. We are in the midst of a deep adjustment in the property sector, high debt level, and very unbalanced structure of the economy where we have too little consumption, too much investment. But we also have new challenges. And of course, another old challenge was the big inequality. Inequality really worsened since the reform period. Around 10 years ago, the government started to talk about common prosperity. So common prosperity is not a new concept. It started being talked about for 10 years. And the government focused on the rural-urban, they noticed the widening of the rural-urban divide. That's the issue we won't have a lot of time to talk about at the moment. But for policymakers in China, that's a huge problem because you do have half of the people not enjoying the same rights, the same access, the same welfare, and they're born to be so. And that's very unfair. And that could be a deep social problem going forward, and that needs to be addressed. But it touches on a lot of interest, and the interest of urban people, for example. And so we can talk about that later. But there are also new challenges now people are more aware of. One of the new challenges, of course, is the aging population. And China's total population has started to decline. Working age population has been declining for 10 years. And so I see a lot of pessimistic view about, oh, wow, China's population is going to be 700 million by end of the century. It's going to be the same about the US, even though 700 million is still a lot of people, but of course it's half of what we are. So what about China's long-term future? Another new challenge, of course, is the geopolitical tension that's risen in the last few years. And coming to the economic front, China is facing technology restrictions of access to technology, especially advanced technology. And that could pose severe challenges to China's long-term future as well. So given that, how much can China really grow? Can China still grow? So here, I think I just talk, obviously it's very, each topic warrants very long discussions, but I will just touch on a few things. So again, I think my basic takeaway is that these challenges are real and very difficult, but I think I'm not as pessimistic as many people in the market. Looking at the labor market, look at the demographics. Indeed, China's population has started to decline. But is China running out of people to work at the moment? No, because we have youth unemployment of 21%, right? We have deflationary pressure. Even though as the economy is growing at this pace, it's not growing fast enough. There's big output gap, right? So right now, China is not running out of people to work. So we shouldn't confuse long-run issues with the current problem. And also, in China, still more than 20% of employment is in farming, and they are not needed there. So there is still room to transfer them out of farming with maybe hukou reform with some policy support. And China's average retirement age is at 54. For a country that life expectancy is very close to OECD average, that's very young. If you increase that by 3 years, by 2030, that will add 40 million people to the labor force, largely offset the decline of working age population. So it's not end of the world. And also, of course, the average education level of the labor force is increasing. So that means that each person can be more productive as well. So that's on the labor market side. On the technology side, just very quickly, I would say that I think the restrictions on China's access to advanced technology is very serious. I refer to the export control that came out in October last year. I think people, companies, investors are still grappling with the potential impact because it's not clear how they are going to implement it, how many allies they're going to, be very tightly united behind the United States on it. Of course, also how China will respond to it. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But I think as an economist, the simple way to look at it is that innovation is hard, high risk, high cost. Without help, without access to the existing advanced technology, without the help from others, it's going to be harder and costlier. That's just the, I think, reality. So therefore, I think on the high-tech side, it will be very difficult for China. I think it will lead to China investing more and getting less returns, therefore lower productivity growth at the macro level. However, again, I bring back my glass half full part of the story, which is China, after very long term of rapid growth, its GDP per capita is still less than 20% of the US level. What does that mean? That means our productivity is still relatively low compared to the frontier, compared to the advanced economies. That also means there's a lot of scope to catch up. You don't have to be at the frontier, at the most cutting edge on every industry. There's plenty of industries that China is still relatively behind. You can apply matured technology more widely using automation, robotics, applying digital technology. In some areas, like electric vehicles, there could be new technology which is not really new, very mature. You just apply it, and that you have potential to invest more and grow and see productivity gains. So therefore, even though I think China faces a lot of obstacles at the cutting edge, but I'm pretty confident that at the macro level, China still have a lot of scope to move up the value chain, move up the technology level of the general manufacturing sector. And so, put this together, we think China can still grow on average more than 4% in this decade, which is obviously much lower than before. But for economy that's at $17 trillion, 4+% means 1/3 of the global growth this decade will still come from China. So this is why for people who are extremely bearish on investing in China, I would say, well, this decade it will still be the second largest economy, if not becoming the first largest, still the second largest capital markets. It's not going anywhere, and most growth will still come from here, and so companies can have a choice to decide, of course, whether to continue to play in this market. Finally, before I end up on too positive a note, of course, there's always risk in that outlook. And so as I mentioned, there are quite a lot of challenges ahead. There are old problems, new problems, and a lot of questions, can China sustain growth? To me, as I mentioned, I think the technology front, the demographic fronts, you have the glass half full part of the story. Most important part, perhaps, that is in my mind, I'm sure in a lot of people's mind, is that one key thing that the Chinese government did right in the last 40+ years was, starting from the late 70s, launching reforms and keeping the country open. And when they encountered, waves and waves of various problems, they were pragmatic and they were adaptive to adjust their policies. Because at any point of time, in the 90s, during the financial crisis and so on, you think, well, how is China going to really overcome this insurmountable challenge at those times? And China was able to. And one thing is that the government adjusted their policy, they were pragmatic and they were adaptive. So the question is that going forward, will the government continue to be as pragmatic, as adaptive as they were in the past, and not let their reforms stay stagnant and push through some of these reforms that will touch on deeply entrenched interests in the society. I don't have a clear answer. I'm cautiously optimistic because I think pressures do build up. I mean, of course, today's timing is slightly good for me because if we haven't had the Politburo meeting, I'm sure people will say, does the government still care about growth? After the meeting on Monday, at least I can say, it seems they still care. So, maybe we will still see, reforms continue to be pushed. I'll stop here. I think I've used up my time.
No, thank you, Dr. Wang, for this wonderful presentation. So I'll kick off a few questions, and then I'll open up to the audience to ask away. So you touch upon debt, the rising debt level. I think one of the chapters of the book is about how serious is the debt problem. So the obvious question is, how serious is that debt problem, actually?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. It's very serious, but not necessarily in the way that people in Western markets are familiar with. So China's overall debt to government, corporate, household together is about 3%, 300% of GDP. Very high, higher than most countries, higher than the US. So, from that point of view, it seems very serious. Also, debt to some sectors, like local government, right, is facing payment issues because local government do not have good cash flow, especially at the moment. So they don't even have enough cash flow to pay their interest. So it seems very serious as well at the moment. However, there are a few things that reduces the risk of a typical debt crisis. A typical debt crisis or financial crisis in emerging markets or in the market economy tend to be a liquidity crisis. It's not because people know the bad debt is very high. It's because people do not trust them anymore, so they don't give liquidity to the banks, and banks don't give liquidity to the companies. So then you have liquidity crisis, and you have a credit crunch, asset price goes down, the currencies depreciate, foreigners leave, and so on. In the case of China, first of all, China has very high savings. So 95% of the debt or more are domestic debt. So foreigners may be very pessimistic about China, but they don't really matter in this specific area, right? Because it's all domestic debt. Second thing is that domestic debt are largely with banks. And the high saving that people have are with banks and bank deposit. And banks are state-owned, and we have capital controls. So you can't really go anywhere. And so there's a stable funding for the banks. And also because banks are state-owned, the government typically pressure banks to increase lending to or continue lending to areas that have a payment issue, whether it's property developers or local government or excess capacity sectors and so on. So you don't have a pull of the plug, liquidity plug. So you don't have an easy sort of liquidity crisis. The government often also have pressure to have the debtors and creditors sitting together and say, we'll coordinate and you work out a restructuring plan. So that's the positive side. The negative side is many people, as somebody mentioned Japan, so similar to Japan, you carry the debt, you don't solve it immediately, you carry the debt burden for a long period of time. And so zombie companies, inefficient players in the market are not cleared right away. So that's a burden on the productive side of the economy. So your returns to equity, your returns to your total assets are going to be depressed because of that. So there are definitely problems with it. So it's serious, but not in a way that we're going to see a big debt crisis or bank run anytime soon.
So you also touch upon the capital control, right? So obviously it's very difficult to get money out with the control. Do you see that weakening over time? And we live in a very complicated world right now. There's many ways to get money out of China. So is this control still relevant to control, or what do you see that going forward as well for China?
Yeah, so capital control is never watertight. There's always leakage. Sometimes when sentiment changes, there's more leakage than others. But I would say that China's capital control is still, by and large, quite effective. People may be able to take, 100,000 or, even a million out, but you cannot, take out the billions in a second, right? That's what free capital flow means. So I think, by and large, it's still effective because they mainly control the flows of corporate institutions and banks and so on. For individuals, there's always going to be some kind of a leakage. Going forward, as I said, I've been covering China for decades. I still remember the goal of making China's capital account convertible by the year of 2000. And then say by 2010. And then we talk about internationalization. And 23 years later, here we are. So I think it's a long-term, in the long term, I still think some form of capital control will still be in place, especially given what we talked about, the debt situation in China. Liquidity is important. You don't want to open that liquidity gate.
So I'm going to open up the floor. Any questions we can kick off? Yep. You want to, maybe the gentleman at the back first? No. Yep.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for the analysis. I'd like to hear your view on the Evergrande situation, which just announced huge debt of over 2,400 billion. To what extent, how serious do you think the problem is? And to what extent is on tip of an iceberg? And will it spread to other sectors, for example, banking? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't cover individual companies, so I can't really comment on individual. But everybody knows they have a lot of debt. They already defaulted on their debt last couple of years. Is that more sector-wide issue? We also have that answer. Dozens of property companies have already defaulted on their debt, right? And property sales and construction have adjusted very deeply. In the last quarter, housing starts is running at 36% of the 2020 level. So it's really down. Sales is down, 1/3 as well. So we are definitely in a very deep property adjustment. Evergrande may have its own problem, high leverage and very aggressive risk-taking, and it has its own business model that's not representative of the whole sector. But the sector is facing other challenges as well. Will it transfer to the banking system? Banks have a lot of exposure to the property sector. But I think we have seen that the authorities already revised their property policy late last year, start to support the property sector and support giving some credit support. It was not implemented as much as people expected. So we saw continued decline in sales and in developer financing situation. So that's why Monday's Politburo meeting statement is very, sends a strong signal for the market. They basically no longer mentioned housing is for living, not for speculation, but also they acknowledge there has been significant changes in the supply and demand fundamentals in the property market, and therefore property policy needs to be adjusted appropriately. What does that mean? That means previously they worried about debt, worried about housing price going up too much. Right now they need to worry about stabilizing the sector, stabilizing the economy, stabilizing the financial sector. So there will be more, so everybody, including myself and people in the market, are looking for additional specific measures to support the property sector, and so that it does not become a systematic, have systematic impact on banks and so on.
Thank you, Mark Michelson. I'm Asia. Thank you for a wide-ranging assessment. I chair a group of regional CEOs of multinational companies, and many of them agree about China going forward. They're worried But when they ask who's the next China, many of them say China's the next China, despite all the issues. So, but a couple of issues you raised are worrying. One, the Politburo statement. As you said, a lot of it was positive. But for example, on private companies, they said it's necessary to encourage enterprises to dare to venture, dare to invest, dare to take risks, and actively create markets, which sounds very positive, but a lot of companies would say that really hasn't happened so much in the past few years. And in fact, there's concern about that. That may have been true at the beginning, and many of the tech companies in particular did operate pretty much like that. But is that going to be true going forward? Do we have any comfort in that statement? And one more, on the social side, consumer spending is really important to many companies. Of course, hasn't picked up in many areas as quickly as we hoped. One of the issues is the social safety net you mentioned. Housing, healthcare, education, the hukou system in particular, the reform. Do you see any progress? It's been talked about a long time. Do you think this might be the time finally when you can move forward? Because there's a lot of pushback. As you mentioned, the central government isn't completely all-powerful.
Right. Thank you. So on the private sector confidence, so I would say the statement is, I'm sure, is welcomed by the private sector, but the private sector wants to see concrete measures. They want to see, what's the actual implementation. So, do we take comfort that they reiterate, they understand the issue, that the businesses, private sector businesses are worried? I think, yes, we take comfort that they understand the issue and they want to boost the confidence. But I think I and everybody else would say, okay, let's see what concrete measures will be implemented, right? So we have to watch in the coming months and years. It will take time. Even if there are some concrete measures announced, people will still remain skeptical and say, I hope you don't change next year, right? So we shall see. On the social safety net and other kind of reforms, yes, I think the direction is very clear, but it does have difficulties. For example, hukou you mentioned, right? So it's about entitlement, right? Behind entitlement is money. Who's going to pay for that entitlement? That's the fiscal challenge, and local governments are very challenged at the moment. Second thing is that entitlement, right? If half of the room gets some privilege, the other half doesn't, you say the other half will get it, this half will not be very happy. So I used to enjoy the privilege, and now I have to share with others, right? And so how to balance that resistance in the society? Everybody has their own interest to think of. They need to be very careful in that front. So I think the likely way to go forward is the government gradually increase spending in public services, in smaller cities, in rural areas, rather than say open up, hukou of Beijing and Shenzhen, let everybody in, because the Beijing and Shenzhen people will be very unhappy, and they will not have enough space for everyone. So it's a typical Chinese characteristic, is that they reform just like before. They did not reform SOEs. They allowed, in the 80s and so on. They started by allowing foreign companies and private companies to grow. So over time, the private sector became bigger, SOEs became smaller and less important, right? So I think on these reform front, it will be similar way.
There's a question.
And Tao, great book and great talk, and full of admiration for you to come up with this very insightful book while holding a very demanding job.
Thank you.
I guess my question is closely related to the previous one, again on the confidence issue. You already noted the narrative against China, but the narrative about China at this point is very negative, and it's negative both domestically and internationally. I would love to hear your thoughts on how confidence can repair. Do you see this is more gradual process, or it can be some sort of big events that could somehow tip the confidence? I mean, going downhill when the narrative turns negative against China, there were a few big events, big sort of points people can pinpoint, the tightening of regulation on tutoring sort of centers and events. So I'm just wondering whether the process of confidence repair could be sort of gradual, or some sort of big events can sway the confidence around. Thank you.
That's very hard to say. Thank you for your question. Oh, by the way, I should advertise my book. And if you wanted to get a book, it's available there. My son will take care of you if you want to get a book. You are at Bloomberg, so you probably know better how international sentiment has changed over time. I think it's a lot of things accumulating to that. But if you want me to point to one event, I think it's probably with the Trump administration with the trade war and so on. A lot of the narratives, I'm afraid there's a lot of politics on that front as well. So there is a lot of focus on the negative part, and China, of course, itself was not doing a great job telling its own story, and there were certain policies coming out of surprising to the market. So it's a combination. But I think the Trump administration's focus on the trade war is probably a good timeline to look at. But there are lots of events.
I think.
Hi, Mark Hayden. I'm in supply chain. We're seeing a snowballing contraction of manufacturing in China. Part of it as a result of, as you said, the trade war. But it's the exodus of investment out of China, not only foreigners but also local, is snowballing. With the slowdown in domestic consumption, we see that as causing even further problems. So my question is, how much longer do you see that contraction of manufacturing, and what will the problems be as a result if it doesn't turn around in the next year to 2 years?
Right. So on the investment, I think we are seeing major shifts in global supply chain, but that's not new. So the supply chain shifts have been happening for quite some time, right? And so in Asia, we have this flying geese model, right? And certain labor-intensive sectors moved from country to country, and already more than 10 years ago, Vietnam produced more Nike shoes than in China, right? So that was already happening, and this was, of course, accelerated by the trade war, the need to diversify risk, reduce the risk, and by now the tech restrictions, and as well, I think there are some push factors maybe from China as well. So this is certainly happening, but it's not necessarily new. At the same time, I think China is also has seen, until recently, steady inflows of investment, because China's market got bigger and bigger as well. So for people who are producing for Chinese markets, they are bringing investment into China, because export as a share in China is becoming smaller and smaller as well, right? So you have two moving parts. But at the moment, I think there are additional factors. One is concerns about the long-term direction. Two is cyclically, we see profits down, orders down, private company going through deep property adjustment. Private companies are not doing very well. So it's very rational for people to see that they are not going to invest at the moment. But I think some of that is temporary, right? And so as we go back to the trend growth, there will still be a lot of investment opportunities. So to answer your question, how long I think the outflow will continue, but there will also be inflows, and some of the excess saving that we see will be deployed again when the economy starts to pick up.
Hi, Tony Watson, Far East Investment Management. Two unrelated questions. One, property sector. Can you give an indication as to the supply-demand mismatch in the sector? Two, given your comments on the never-ending capital controls, does that essentially put paid to the idea that the renminbi will eventually displace the USD as a reserve currency and a currency of a key currency of trade denomination, i.e. for commodities and such? So 2 questions: supply-demand mismatch in property. Second one is displacement of USD as a trade currency. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. On the property supply and demand, it's very hard to say because in the property sector in China, a lot is driven by sentiment. And sentiment is very hard to predict. If people feel the future is not bright, they will, even if they have so-called inelastic demand, the actual demand, they may delay it and they may change their view. But in general, my colleague in the property side have basically estimated that or forecast that the longer term, say 5 years down the road, the new equilibrium of property demand should be probably 30% lower than the peak, which is 2021, between 20 to 21, that period, right? But as I mentioned, right now, housing starts, new starts is running at 1/3 of that level. And so I think we are in a over-adjustment period. We are in a destocking period. Of course, how long this destocking lasts depends on the demand side. Can some of the fundamental demand be released, like with removal of purchase restrictions, of lowering of down payment requirement, economy recovering, that may push that up a little bit. If that doesn't happen, then you could have a longer period of adjustment. But basically from the population, urbanization, everything, we are no longer from 10 years or 20 years ago. The demand is no longer, we're no longer experiencing that kind of demand. So the second question is on internationalization of the RMB. So I think over the very long run, I'm confident that China remains the second largest, or if not the largest economy. It becomes more, the capital markets, the trade, it becomes increasingly important, so that RMB plays a bigger role. Because RMB right now, the role is very small. It's behind not only the euro, but the yen and so on, right? And China is a much larger economy and trading partner. However, I think that in the foreseeable future, let's say next 10 years, it's very difficult to see major progress for RMB to displace the dollar. I think becoming a major currency and displacing the dollar, there's still, a major currency could be your 10-20% of the share. Displacing the dollar means you're more than 50% of the share. That's there's still a long way to go. And also, being the major currency in denominating trade and the major reserve currency is different, right? A lot of trade is already denominated in RMB or settled in RMB, but maybe the price still in dollar. And at the end of the day, after you paid RMB to buy something, you still want to hold dollar as your reserves. That's different, and that requires not just the capital flow issue, it also requires you have a deep, liquid domestic RMB asset market, which we have trouble creating. You have a transparent monetary policy. People at least know when the central bank is going to meet and what parameters they are looking at to change their interest rate. What instrument do you have to hedge the risk? People are not really worried about holding volatile currencies as long as they know how to hedge the risk. But I think there are many things I think still need further development for RMB to play a much bigger role.
We have time for one final question. I think, yeah, that will be.
Thank you. Robin Harding from the Financial Times. As you mentioned, there's a very large output gap in China. We're seeing consumer prices close to deflation. That presumably raises real interest rates. Do you see any risk of a liquidity trap forming in China? And if not, why not? Thank you.
Yeah, right now, obviously, I think the monetary policy alone is not going to be very effective. Other than lowering interest rate could make housing, mortgage more affordable, and that could spur some demand. But for the corporate sector, as I mentioned, if you have your orders down, the earnings down, it's not about I'm not borrowing at the cheap rates. It's about I need some cash flow, I need some business. And so therefore, I think, yeah, at this moment, monetary policy is, especially rate cut, is not very effective. And so I think it's hard to see China fall into that kind of trap. It's because, of course, China still can use fiscal policy and quasi-fiscal policy. So hence, issuing more bonds or using more policy bank lending, pressuring banks to increase lending to local governments and property developers. These are all policies at their tools at their disposal, unlike in some other markets, I suppose. So I think if there is a will, if they understand that this is necessary, which I think by now they do understand, then these measures will be pushed forward, and so therefore the policy stimulus will then be effective.
So with that, thank you very much, Dr. Tao Wang, for this fascinating discussion with everyone. Hope you guys all enjoy this talk as well. The book is available outside if you want to look at it. It is a very good read. I actually read it within 48 hours.
And only 200 Hong Kong dollars. I
I
negotiated with my publisher, Routledge, so
yeah.
to lower
And feel free to stay behind for a quick chat with Dr. Wang as well. She'll be around for a while. And she's also an FCC member, so you might see her at the bar around as well. So thank you very much. And as a token of appreciation, I'll just quickly maybe give you a quick, yeah. Oh, thanks. Thank you.